Thanks for getting the stew out of the way.
Okay.
Not so much here today.
There are people who are aware of us. And if you remember kind of the progressing ladder of involvement with our movement, the next step is what? Anybody remember? It starts with C.
Curiosity.
Curiosity.
Good job, Lou.
That turns into
Interest.
interest.
Good job. You
That
did
turns
good.
into a spiritual hunger or longing to know. And that turns into a moment of decision. Some people do this progression in months. Some people, one of my favorite stories, which will come later in our sessions, take 10 years. John in Ohio, where we came from, it was 16 years that I knew him, not counting the years before that, before he went from here to here. That's another story which I may or may not have time to share in all of our stuff. Now, the reality is, it doesn't usually go like this in a straight line progression. Sometimes it's like this. A person's spiritual and emotional involvement in our movement fluctuates before they finally come to that moment of decision. So, Bethany, Oklahoma, the only congregation in the church that owned a 40-foot fire truck, which is a whole other story. But it was a wonderful tool. So instead of just like in a pickup truck in a parade, we drive a fire truck in the parade with the name of our church on the side. And you need a 40-foot truck because our name is long. It was also an attraction at picnics and neighbor kids and whatever. There was a district picnic at Bethany, and kids were hanging around on the fire truck having a great time. And a young man came up to me and started asking questions. He is an attender of our church from not too long after he and his wife got married, and his wife is a member of the church, a lifelong member of the church. So he would go to church with her on occasion. So his connection to us was sort of off and on. But at this particular picnic, he had serious questions. And I thought, wow, this is great, because he's not shown this level of interest. This is beyond curiosity. This is interest in this kind of artificial scale. There aren't really stages. It's sort of a progression with steps in between. I hope you all understand that. And I thought, oh my goodness, we talked for a long time. The next time I saw him when I was in his congregation, he was kind of back down to here again. And then one day, I forget who preached the inspiring sermon at our district conference. When I was a district president, I was very aggressive at bringing in guest ministers. So I had all 3 members of the presidency of the church to my district to do ministry. I had all 7 of the presidents of the 70 in my district to do ministry. I had about 6 of the 12 apostles into my district to do ministry. And all of that in a 3-year time span. I was a district president for 3 years. So they were in, you get the point. Because people are fed when they are around the major spiritual, organizational leaders of our movement. Well, it was, and I don't remember which church leader preached the sermon that morning, but it really got a hold of this guy. And so he was like here. And I thought, this is exciting. But the next time I was in his congregation, not a district event, he was back down to here again. So he was up and down and up and down. After 2 years of this up and downness, or 3, I forget exactly how long, we had another conversation. And he was deeply invested. And from there, we took off. In fact, after that visit, I thought, he's ready. You've heard this line before. So I said to him, we have this thing in our church called cottage meetings. And if you've been here before, you know what the rest of that little spiel is. And I said, if you'd like to do that sometime, let me know. And he says, I'm ready now. Let's start. So we had the cottage meetings. We had not finished the 6 or 7 or however many cottage meetings we had, when in the middle of it he says, I'm ready to do this. I want to be baptized. So I just want you to know, don't expect things to be a straight line progression, because often it's sort of a come and go thing. Which brings me to this side. This is my favorite tangible reminder of a special series of events. This is not me, this is some other person. I was not running for sheriff, and I have no qualifications to be a sheriff, no law enforcement training whatsoever.
It's a federal offense. That doesn't stop other politicians from doing it.
I was not the sign stealer.
His wife.
I was preaching at the Union Avenue congregation, one of several congregations in the Grand Rapids, Michigan metropolitan area. And this young man with a huge smile came up to me, and something in my sermon sparked something in him. I didn't know his name. I didn't know anything about him. He walked up to me. He said, my name's Gene. This is my wife, Brenda. And we had this conversation. And he said, Melissa was with me on this occasion, I want you and your wife to come to our house for dinner sometime. So we checked our calendars and we found a day, and Melissa and I hopped in our car and we drove the hour and 15 minutes to their house, and we had dinner. And the whole dinner was packed with questions. Dinner began with pie. I remember that distinctly. And he said, at our house, dinner always begins with dessert. So at some future point, I was in Grand Rapids, and he was there, and he said, I would love for you and Melissa to come again. Now we had, I forget how many of these dinners we had, 2 or 3 at their home that we would drive up there. And he was loaded with questions. I could tell something had happened to him. Now, in the course of all of this, I learned who the other key people are in his story. I'm not going to have you turn to 1 Corinthians 3, but Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. Now, if you remember my David York story, somebody's got to do what at the beginning for something to grow? Plant a seed. And then that little seed starts to grow. And what do you do when the seed starts to grow?
Water it.
You water it. Now, David York would say, then the next thing you do is you cover it with nitrogenous growth stimuli, which is a fancy name for fertilizer. Okay, and as you know from 2 weeks ago, you don't put fertilizer on a tiny little plant. Cottage meetings is like heavy-duty fertilizer. You don't do cottage meetings when somebody's just sort of curious. You'll burn up the plant. Well, anyway, that analogy, not the fertilizer part, comes from the Apostle Paul. I planted what? Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. And then Paul goes on to say, the planter and the waterer are one. What is that saying? The people are equally valuable in the process. And it doesn't matter where in the process you are involved. Now, in the case of my friend Gene, if I'm to use Paul's analogy, when he got married, that was the seed. And he came to church, and he bonded with the pastor. So the pastor was the person who did the watering. And at the appropriate time in his life, somebody came along, Bill Dodds. Anybody know Bill Dodds?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. Bill Dodds applied the fertilizer. And then I come along. I showed up late in the season and in time for the harvesting. So there were 4 people that were key in Gene making the ultimate decision to become a part of our faith movement. And that is how it usually is. It's not usually one person who does it all. It is a group of people who do it. Now, not only do you have these people who were involved in his life in detailed ways, he was surrounded by a loving, caring community of faith, the Union Avenue congregation. They all had a part in that too. They created the climate, the environment in which the seeds that were planted could grow. So, in the good old days, and I can show you on a map 8 congregations, and that tells you where the 2 missionaries traveled. There was not a member of the church in eastern Oklahoma. 2 missionaries showed up. They came to a town. They did what the missionaries did in those days. They rented a schoolhouse or a community building or something, and they had a week of meetings. And from A to Z, they told the whole story of the restoration. Jesus, church, Joseph Smith Jr., story, the church up to whenever they did this, which was during the presidency of Joseph Smith III. And at the end, they would say, who wants to be baptized? Now that's like doing the whole shebang with a tender plant. So when they come into town, back then before there were movie theaters and entertainment, it was entertaining to go hear whatever itinerant missionaries were coming to town. Didn't matter if it was our missionaries or Baptist missionaries, whoever, people would show up. So you would rent a schoolhouse and 40 or 50 people would show up. They would do their thing for 5 or 6 nights. They would come back for follow-up visits, but at the last night they would say, who would like to be baptized? How many people would ask to be baptized? 50 people, right? No. All those plans aren't ready. Maybe 1, maybe 2. And they would baptize the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 that were baptized at the end of the week, and then they would come back, and check on them, and then they moved to the next town. So if you look at a map of eastern Oklahoma, you can trace their route week after week. So anyway, while they're doing the weeknight thing here, guess what they're doing? They're going back here to work with the people that have been baptized. But the whole show, the whole shebang, the whole plant to harvest thing was on the shoulders of 2 people. We have it so much easier in a way because there's all of us involved. Anytime somebody walks in those doors that's not a member of our church, who are they influenced by? All of us. And Dale, of course. Because he is a, I don't know if you know this, but I have done ministry in over 250 congregations in the United States. That doesn't count my ministry in congregations in other countries. I know what congregations are like. We have one of our best greeters. Hand of applause, please. He really is one of the best greeters that I've encountered in 250 plus congregations in the community of Christ, scattered all over this country, from California to Connecticut. All right. Eraser. So, Gene and Brenda. Gene is here for a variety of reasons, and during the time I was invested in his life up till the day we moved, because that investment doesn't end when somebody is baptized, he went from there to there. Now, from the time I got involved, it took about a year or 2. You don't rush the plant. Every plant grows at its own speed. So one day we were at the Camp Manitou reunion. Or not Camp Manitou, we were at the Camp Manitou campground for a weekend retreat. Now, before me, he would come to church. After I'd been involved in his life for a while, he started showing up for weekend events at the campground. He had not done that before. In fact, he is at this retreat without Brenda. Brenda had obligations and couldn't be there. He's there by himself. So when some guy drives an hour and a half to a church campground without his wife, what does that tell you? He's getting invested. He's in this hunger to know phase. So Melissa and I have made trips up to have dinner with them. I have made trips to visit with him. If I preached anywhere in the Grand Rapids area, he would show up, and things were progressing nicely. So here we are, and I knew he was close, but I didn't know how close. So he walks up to me on the Camp Manitou campgrounds at this weekend event, and he says, "Jim, what am I waiting for?" I said, "I don't know, Gene. What are you waiting for?" He said, "Let's do this. I'm ready to be baptized." He said, I'll probably get up and announce it in the service tonight." I said, "Okay, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to the telephone and call Brenda. She needs to hear first before anybody else." So he did that. He went and called her on her phone. She was super excited. He got up and announced it that night. But anyways, we stood there outside one of the ramshackle buildings at Camp Manitou that eventually burned down, which was a blessing or an act of God. Lord, it's from that. As we stood out of this ramshackle building, he looked at me and he was so excited, and I looked at him, I said, "Gene, this is a glory hallelujah day." I had never used that phrase before in my life. That was the day and the moment that I pinned that phrase. And I did a little dance. He said, "What is that?" I said, "That's my pre-baptismal dance." He said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, "This is the first time and possibly the last time I will do a pre-baptism." But I did a little Irish jig dance thing in celebration of his decision. I have since, on very special occasions in ministry in Michigan and then ministry in Ohio, said to somebody after a fantastic service, "Wow, this is a glory hallelujah day." And I have friends here and there across the church that now use that expression for really extraordinary occasions. This is a glory hallelujah day. But it started that afternoon at the campground at Camp Manitou in southwest Michigan. A glory hallelujah day. So it was so exciting when he was baptized and confirmed. So I don't know how many months it was after his baptism, but Melissa and I were sitting in our home on Romans Road in Portage, Michigan, and we lived on a busy street. The city put out a counter that counts how many cars go by. 50,000 cars a day went by our street. That's busy. You do the math. Most of that is between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. when people are driving to and from work and all that. So most of that 50,000 cars a day is in about a 9-hour time stretch. And then in the evening it kind of tapers off. Which means as we sat in our living room and looked out our window at all the, it means you kind of become immune to the movement, unless something exciting happens. Like I remember hearing a horrible crash and somebody not paying attention rear-ended somebody else right on the street, right in front of our front yard, and pretty soon a police car showed up, and then I heard the squeal of brakes. And another car narrowly missed running into the police car. And the officer hears the squeal of brakes, and he turns, and he's looking, and he's ready to watch his cruiser get, but the person got stopped. But then the next car rear-ended the car behind the police cruiser. So things like that I noticed, in front of on our street. Which means I don't usually notice most things. So I'm sitting in our living room, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and I'm reading, and I caught something out on the corner of my eye outside. I thought, what was that? Now see, it wasn't a car, something caught my eye. And I looked for a minute, and there's a tree in our front yard, and I could see just the hint of an elbow of somebody hiding behind a tree in our front yard. Now, this is not a usual thing at my place. No one has ever hid behind the tree in our front yard before. No one even gets out, you know. There was not, you know, so no one gets out there. You know, people walk down the sidewalk, but, and I'm what on earth is that? So I keep watching. And I said, Melissa, somebody's out in our front yard. Then the person hiding behind the tree stuck this sign in our front yard. It was Gene. I don't know where he got this. The election season was over, so I don't think he actually stole it during the actual election season time. But he saw Jim Doty on it, and it just tickled his funny bone. He says, I think I will go surprise Jim. So on this afternoon, he drove the hour and 15 minutes to our house and stuck this in our front yard. So I waited till he was all done. I wanted him to have his fun. And when he was all done and sneaking to his car in our driveway, I opened the door. I says, hi, Gene, what are you doing? And he knew he was busted. So he came in and we had a nice chat. So I still have this sign because it is a reminder, a tangible reminder of the whole Gene and Brenda story. I confess that during election season last year, I put this out in my front yard just to confuse people here in Lamoni, Iowa. So that is the Gene and Brenda story. Oh, there's a sequel. Gene picked up on the I planted Apollos watered story from the Apostle Paul. Gene attended one of my friendship evangelism workshops so he could learn how to do his part in helping people become connected with our movement. He saw the whole David York story with the plant and the fertilizer and all that. So he was talking to somebody and they said, how on earth did you become a member of our church? Now this is at night after campfire. We were right outside the dining hall. Above the dining hall are some guest bedrooms, one of which was occupied by Danny Belrose. So Danny Belrose's bed is by his window and he hears this conversation. So Gene is trying to summarize the story. And he said, so my wife prepared the ground and my pastor planted the seeds. And then Bill Dodds fertilized me. At which point Danny Belrose's voice came from the upstairs window and says, Gene, reword your story. If you say Bill applied the fertilizer, that's okay, but don't say Bill Dodds fertilized me. That's not the way to tell a baptismal story. And I'm sitting here thinking, oh yeah, but what a great story. I'm going to share this. All right. What this is all about is we can't predict who will go from aware of us to a moment of decision. We don't know we don't know which persons we know that will be. So as I said last week, since we don't know who it'll be, what do we have to do?
Be nice to everybody.
We have to be nice to everybody, which we should be anyway. And we let whatever happens along the way. So it is not my job as a 70 to get all kinds of people baptized. That's not my job. My job as a 70 is to tune in to people who are on the journey and look like that's where they're headed. And so I tune into them. Some of the people I tune into become members of the church. Some don't. But I think all of them would say their lives, our lives, and I mean their life and mine, are better for our association together. So what we do is we cultivate friendships and we minister to people because that's what good Christians do. We reach out, we get involved in other people's lives. We help them in whatever way they need help. That may be as simple as having a radiator replaced. Our daughter had a friend who had to drive to college, and to his job. And her friend is the son of a pastor. I will not mention the denomination, not our denomination, but a pretty rigid, by the book, dot every I and cross every T kind of pastor. The son made some choices that the dad did not like. And the dad said, this is a horrible story. If you don't go to college to be a doctor or an attorney, I won't pay your way. The son didn't want to be a doctor or an attorney. And the dad, I won't go into the dad's motives. There's parts of the story that there's not time to share. Things got heated, and the dad said to the son, our daughter's friend in college, "Get out of my house. You are no longer my son." Now, I don't like that story, but that's a real story. That's what happens in the real world to some people. Some people have fathers that aren't what fathers should be. So, he's now out of the house and no place to live, so he has to find a really cheap apartment, and he has to survive on the money he makes at his part-time job to put himself through college. And the radiator on his car breaks, and he has no money to fix the radiator. So my daughter is telling me this sad story. In our congregation, we have Dave. Dave repairs radiators for a living. So I told Dave the story, and he said, "I will fix the radiator for free to help out." That's my, yeah. What?
I was the one that talked to Dave.
Yes.
Not you.
Clarification.
I'm going to
Melissa.
take credit for it.
Take credit for it.
Good job.
There you go, Melissa.
She does really great things. Now, how did we get the car to Dave's? I don't remember who towed it, how we got it there.
I don't know.
I don't know either. So, and it was a surprise. So it was a wonderful thing. So, kudos to my daughter for being his friend and sharing the story with us. Kudos to Melissa for contacting Dave. Kudos to Dave for fixing the radiator for free and getting this young man back in his car. Now, that's the end of the story. That young man will probably, I don't know that he'll ever know anything about our church or be associated with our church or join our church or anything. That doesn't matter. The point of the story is that is what we do because we are loving, caring Christians. Now, if my daughter's friend said to Janae, I have permission to quote her, she says, "I am your heathen rebel daughter." I have permission to quote that, or I wouldn't quote that. So, my daughter is not deeply invested in the life of the church. But if her friend would have said to her, "Why would some stranger fix my radiator?" You know, it's possible the story might have come out, well, he belongs to the same church as I do and my parents do. And you know, it is possible in some set of circumstances that he might have wanted to check us out. Now, he didn't, and that's okay. So what I'm saying is, out of this, where's my marker? Out of this vast sea of people who know about us and might be curious about us, only a small percentage of them are going to end up joining our church, and that's okay. What we do want to do is we want to be alert to people and attuned to people that we have some sense of who might be making that journey and be with them on that journey and to water along the way. And when it's appropriate, add a little fertilizer and do all the right things. So of all the people I know in this world, the Gene Hartneys of the world are the exception, not the rule. Most of the people I associate and are involved with are not going to join our church. I'm okay with that. It's not my job to get everybody into our church. It's my job to tune into God and say, okay, God, if somebody's going to make this journey, help me be aware of that. And every now and then, I will be in some congregation, and somebody not named Gene will come up and ask questions, and all of a sudden I will realize, oh my goodness, I think this person's kind of on the road. And now I have to make sure that I am not so busy that I miss out on the opportunity. Melissa and I drove 2.5 hours from our home to go to a district conference in a neighboring district to the district I was district president of. We were in Texas. It was a long day. There was stuff in the morning. There was stuff in the afternoon. So I don't know when in the afternoon things ended, 3 o'clock or some, I don't know. I don't remember. Didn't write this down. We walked, who's the last person out of the church building? I'm almost always the last person out of the church building. I'm always wandering around talking and visiting and trying to be helpful and whatever. And Melissa's patiently, usually waiting, not patiently waiting. I love to have her here so she can like make these little corrections along the way. I am tired. I worked hard all day. We got a 2.5 hour drive home. I want to get home. So when the last conversation in the church was over and the pastor was ready to lock the door, I walked out to the car. I got in the car. Melissa's already there. And I'm ready to turn the ignition and drive home, and Melissa says, see that young woman at the bottom of the church steps? She's waiting around. I think she wants to visit with you. That's not what I wanted to do. I want to go home. But I get out of the car, and I walk over to her, and I said, how are you doing? And, well, okay. It was sort of a half-hearted okay. And we chatted a little bit, and she finally, no names for this story, she finally said, I've recently learned I am pregnant. And my husband, who has no association with our church, declared, when we learned I was pregnant, he said to me, you will never be allowed to take our baby to your church. What was, I thought, a short conversation became a quite lengthy conversation. We talked about all kinds of things. We talked about relationships. I asked questions I almost never ask people. I said, exact quote, how are things in the bedroom? She said, not so good. Earlier in the conversation, she said, he regularly invites me to tractor pulls and car races and stuff like that. And he always asks me to go Sunday morning, even though these events also happen on Saturday. He doesn't ask me to go Saturday. He asked me to go Sunday morning. So that story, and then the other question, I finally looked at her, I said, my instincts tell me he thinks that the church is competing with him for your affections. For him, it's a competition between him and our church. That's why he asks you Sunday mornings. He wants you to choose to go with him instead of going to church. And so every time you say no, because you're deeply committed to the church, guess how he views that? I said, at the end of the conversation, I made several suggestions. Here are 2 of them. Please turn up the temperature in the bedroom. Men's egos are tied to how things are going in that department. And if things aren't going well, that is a blow to their ego, and that causes problems. Now, sometimes when you talk to somebody and you get a nudge from the Holy Spirit, you tread into dangerous territory, and that's sort of dangerous territory. But it needed to be said. And I said, and I want you to do something. How often does he ask you to do this? She says, pretty often. Sometime in the next month, if he asks you, go with him on Sunday morning. He knows you love church. He needs to know that sometimes you will pick him. I said, I will be back in your home congregation in about a month, and we'll talk. In the meantime, you will be at the top of my prayer list. You will be the first person I pray for every morning. You will be the first person I pray for when I go to bed tonight. So a month later, I was in her congregation. She's loitering around. We talked. I said, how are things going? Not much better. I said, did you go with him on Sunday morning? Well, there wasn't one this month. I said, when it happens, go with him to his tractor pull, car race, demolition, whatever it is on Sunday morning, go with him. He needs to know that sometimes you will pick him over going to church. I said, and keep turning up the temperature in the bedroom. A month later, I saw her at another event, and she said, things are better. All around. Guess what? She says, he asked me on a Saturday morning to go to the whatever it was, the tractor pull or demolition. I said, that's progress. I said, what does he love? She says, he's a hunter. I said, oh my goodness. Do not tell him these men are 70. But I know 270 who are avid hunters. One that lives where I live in central Oklahoma, and one that lives within 30 minutes of you. I am going to ensure that both of those 70 preach in your congregation over the next, sometime in the next month or two. I will make that happen. Gently invite them to church. And drop a teaser. Say, I understand he's an avid hunter, the guest minister. I said, do not tell him he's a 70. Do not tell him that he's a missionary. Just say he's a minister and his hobby is hunting. He came both Sundays to hear both 70s, Roe and David. And I clued them in. I don't care what else you do in your sermon, tell a hunting story. Make it apply to the gospel somehow, but say both told hunting stories. So David, Roe was there first and then David. So after church, her husband is talking to David. And he says, so you like hunting? And David says, oh yeah. He says, I belong to an exclusive game hunting club. We have acres of land where there are lots of pheasants, and only the people who belong to the club can go hunt pheasants. I'm allowed to bring guests. If you ever want to drive up to Oklahoma sometime and go hunting with me, you are welcome. He said, I would like to do that. That didn't happen. Wasn't convenient for their schedules. But David was back, and he said, do you like elk hunting? He says, oh my goodness, I've never done that, but that would be like heaven. He said, do you remember the guy named Roe? He said, yeah. He says, we're going on an elk hunting trip to Colorado. You interested in going along? I don't know the exact conversation, but it was something like, oh my goodness, yes. So come fall, Roe and David and this husband went elk hunting in Colorado. Roe and David made a commitment to each other that during the entire trip they would not say one word about church. Right. Exactly. This is not religious entrapment. I don't believe in religious entrapment. Luring somebody with some kind of bait and then springing the religious trap. That's a no-no. I know other churches teach that. It's wrong. We shouldn't do that in our movement. So they had a great weekend together. I don't know how many of them got elk, but they're driving from Colorado back to Texas to drop him off, and then they're going to go to their homes. And they're about halfway home. Now, he's not dumb. He knows they're ministers. And he's suspicious. So halfway home, he said to them, okay, when are you guys going to spring the trap? Now see, he knows how other Christians sometimes work. And they said to him, what trap? Well, you know, we're like still 6 hours from when are you going to twist this into a church conversation? And they said to him, honestly, we have no plans of having a religious conversation. This is not a trap. We invited you to go hunting, and this trip is about hunting. It's not about church. It's not about trapping you. We don't believe in that kind of thing. So they drive 2 or 3 hours down the road, and he says, could I ask you a question? That was a huge moment. He asked a question. What kind of answer did they give? This kind of answer or this kind of answer? Short. Short. That's right. See, they know these two guys are really excellent Missionaries. Goodness gracious. Last time I talked to Roe, he's baptized 225 people. That's extraordinary. See, I'm just sort of an amateur at that department compared to Roe and his baptismal record. He had a good time. Guess what he did not long after that trip? Came to church with his wife. Now, she's really pregnant now. And not too long after that, he said, if you want to bring our baby to church, that's fine with me. Now, not long after that, I moved. I don't know the rest of the story. He may have joined the church, he may not have. Here's what matters. Because I was wise and skillful and a bit nosy, and because David and Roe are skillful, he decided he likes our church. And he would go with her occasionally, and he was fine with her bringing their baby to church and all of that. That is huge progress. So in my book, it really doesn't matter whether or not he ever decided to join the church, and I don't know if he did or didn't. What matters is the relationship was changed. He was no longer feeling like he was competing with the church for his wife's attention. That was a huge step. All right. I tell those two stories for what reason? One ends up in a baptism and one does not, so far as I know. Why would I tell those two stories together? Yeah. Back to Jesus. Sometimes the seeds grow all the way to harvest, sometimes they don't. That's okay. What matters is there was a dramatic change between this husband and wife and his relationship to the church. That's what matters. That was the goal that I set out when I sensed that he was competing, I thought he was competing with the church for his wife's time and attention, and I wanted to break down that perception in his mind. Thank God, I knew two friends that were hunters, and that was his hobby. I got a call from a pastor, and he said, there's a guy in my congregation who's kind of resistant to church, and he's not happy with his wife going to church. She's one of the stalwarts in my church. I learned the other day his hobby is photography. The next time you come and preach in my congregation, can you tell a photography story? I said, absolutely. And I came, and I did, and he was at church. And after church, he asked me questions. What did he ask questions about? Photography. And the next time I came to preach, he came again. Now, I don't know I don't know where that went. What I do know is all of a sudden he decided, I like that photographer guy. You know, he knows answers to my questions. He knows the root mean square of Fuji Velvia slide film. Now, how many people in this room care about the root mean square of Fuji Velvia slide film? I bet I am the only one. So I'm not even going to define it. But this guy, that is his thing. I was the right person. So over a period of time, he started inviting me to his house to church, after church, to ask me photography questions. So I did that. I don't think we ever had a conversation about the church. That didn't matter. What happened is, because I was a photographer, it changed his relationship in terms of his wife coming to church, and he was less resentful. In fact, he was not resentful after all. He was supportive of that. And sometimes he came to church even when I wasn't preaching and talking about photography. Now, I think that's the only time in my life, that's the only place in my life where I shared photography stories in church, because if I get down that road, who knows when I'll ever get off that track. Are you percolating with the questions, Stu? Mm-hmm. You're just thinking with your fingers?
Uh-huh.
All right.
You're always percolating. I know that you're always percolating.
He's not a photographer. So, this is the progression of people who eventually become part of our movement. And as you learn, it kind of comes and goes. And some people get so far and that's it. That's okay. My job is to be tuned in enough that I sense the people who are headed here. And because I'm a 70, there are sometimes I walk into a congregation and I see somebody, I thought, oh my goodness, that's the person. I already know who the person is. I don't know why I know. I may not be the person that does the work that gets them, but I know who the person is, and if I'm not the person to do that, I know who to get into that congregation to connect with that person to do that. So it's not all on your shoulders to do everything. Okay, Oikos. Keep one for me. Split this in half. I hope there's enough.
My goal is to keep my mouth shut. I'm really, really good.
Yes, you know, you can kind of play with it.
I have more if there's not enough.
Since I have none, I'm going to borrow yours.
Have they made them to the back row?
Jim, you've got one over here.
Okay. All these scriptures on the top half of the page are about oikos relationships. Oikos is a Greek word. It is sometimes loosely translated family or kinship, but oikos for the early church was more than blood kin. It was all the people you associate with and care about. That's oikos. The church grows by oikos relationships. So there's this guy at the grocery store. Every time I come down his aisle to check out his register, he says, "Hi Jim, how are you doing?" I call him by name. I says, "I'm doing good, how are you?" And I don't have a name tag, and somehow he knows my name. I don't know anything about him. He's an acquaintance. He's not part of my oikos relationship. He's just someone that I know his name because of his name tag, and he knows my name because I don't know how he knows my name. But beyond hello, how are you, that is the extent of the relationship. There is no connection there. Now, who knows? Someday that might happen, you know. Someday he might ask an interesting question. I don't know. But I'm not counting on that happening. Oikos is all the people you know that you have a connection with. The church grows through oikos relationships. So I'm going to do a little survey. You're going to do a show of hands. How many of you, your initial contact with our church was family? Raise your hands.
That is shocking. But I guess it's not shocking.
No, and this is okay. How many of you came because you were invited by a friend? Okay. How many read some flyer about some huge church revival somewhere? And some famous, at least in our church, Community of Christ apostle was preaching, and so you went because it was a great revival service. 0. How many of you are here because someone knocked on your door one day? 0. Here's something that Mormons know, and the Seventh-day Adventists know, and the Jehovah's Witnesses know, and very active outreaching Protestant congregations know. Doesn't matter your denomination, the numbers are the same. If you knock on 1,000 doors and ask people at church and give them a little flyer or something, one family will come to church and join the church. That's it. So if 10,000 Mormon missionaries knock on a door tomorrow, how many families will join the Mormon church?
100.
10,000 missionaries. 10. If 10,000 Jehovah's Witnesses knock on doors tomorrow morning, how many people will join the Jehovah's Witnesses? 10. Now, God bless him, Dewey Clark, friend of mine since the 80s, was out with a bunch of people. They were going to knock on 1,000 doors. That was their goal. And so Dewey looked at his neighborhood and he said, God, just show me the door.
That is Dewey.
That's Dewey. Well, God didn't. He knocked on doors. They did knock on a lot of doors. Actually, some family did come to church. So that's just the math. 1 out of 1,000 homes has somebody that's looking, and they're probably going to go to the first person that knocks on their door and invites them. How many doors are there in Lamoni? Not even, way less than 1,000. You know,
So we don't get any, right?
you know. So if we were to go out tomorrow and just start knocking on doors, you know, we would get half a family. Or a little less. My point is, it works, but that's an awful lot of work to do that. And I did that one day. It was a horrendous experience. I was in a missionary class taught by somebody else, and our assignment in the afternoon was we all went out and knocked on doors, and I did it, and I knocked on doors. Hi, I'm from the Community of Christ, and, you know. Are you looking for a church home? You know, how are you doing spiritually? You know, you're asking questions of absolute strangers. And I thought, I hate this. This is a terrible way to do missionary. Give me live people that I have a connection with, or that somebody I know has a live connection with. Because if you've listened to a number of I've told now 10 stories now that resulted in baptisms, and I got 25 on my list, 25 stories on my list. Most of the people I have been connected with, I was not the initial connection, it was somebody else. I will tell you a story where I was the initial connection. I was the person that invited somebody to church. I was with them through the whole process, all the way through their baptism. That story is for another day. My point is this. We grow because we talk to the people we know. And the reason that I'm doing this workshop spread out over a series of Sunday mornings is I want you to tap into the possibilities amongst the people you know that are not family, because your family already knows. You probably know somebody, I said this before, I'll say it again. You probably know somebody that in their heart of hearts, they are looking for what we offer as a movement. But you don't know which person it is. And you want to be alert enough that if an opportunity comes, that you'll kind of have a clue what to do. What's the easiest thing to invite people to church for? What kind of church event? Social events. We're having a potluck dinner Saturday night, or there's this performance group from Graceland and they're going to be singing Saturday night, and there's a light dinner ahead of time. It is important for congregations to regularly have events separated from Sunday morning that we can invite people we know to attend. So that's just part of the barbecues, whatever excuse it is. Now, I'm not saying that people are just going to sort of all of a sudden go, oh wow, I'll go to church, and 3 weeks later they fall into the baptismal font. That's not how that works. What I want to do, and what we're working on, is how in gentle ways you do the right things with people who might be responsive to what we have to offer. So let's go back to curiosity. How do you know somebody's curious? Talked about this last week. They ask questions. They're probably really simple questions. What should your answers be? Short and sweet. That's right. If their questions get longer and more involved, then you take however much time you need to answer their longer, more involved questions. So what happens is the depth and quality of those questions increases. That's how you know. So, since I opened the photography door, Somebody asked me one day, what brand of camera do you shoot? I said, Canon. He said, why? It was recommended to the guy at the camera store. I said, it's not the only good camera, and there are other great cameras, but I started with Canon, I like Canon, I stayed with Canon. End of conversation. Now, if the person, that's a curiosity question. If I'm out taking pictures, I get questions like that all the time. Now, Bob Walker and I have spent many, many hours in Rocky Mountain National Park taking pictures. And he said, it's almost uncanny. He said, we won't be somewhere 5 minutes and somebody comes up and says, can I ask you a question? How are you metering the scene? What's your exposure? What ISO did you choose? Now, not many of you know what all those things mean. That's not a curiosity question, that's a what? That's an interest question. They want to know. They want to apply it to their photography. So I had a neat thing. I was not with Bob, I was in Acadia National Park, and I met a guy, and I found out later when I had a chance to talk to him, he's retired from National Geographic. He said, my life is set. He said, when I shoot for National Geographic, I own the pictures. They have permission to use them and pay me for the photos they use. But at the end of my career, they said, we'll pay you X million dollars for your whole photo library to own it. So basically, the ownership changed from him to them. So when he was going out working for them, they were renting his photos. And they signed a contract. We were going to use this photo in this issue, blah, blah, and we want to use it in this flyer. So, but now they're going to own it completely. He says, they paid me enough, I'm set for life, I can just take pictures for fun. This is late in the day. Several times during the day, I watched people asking him questions. At some point, it was hard for him to take pictures himself because people were flocking around him. Because somebody asked a question, his answer would be really insightful. Other people taking pictures, picture 10 people at a lake, somebody hears him talking, and pretty soon they're clustered around him. That doesn't happen in the spiritual sphere. You don't find 10 people sitting along a lake reading their Bible and somebody says to you, what's your favorite passage of Scripture? People don't apparently go to lakes to read Bible passages. They go to sun or take pictures or drink with you or whatever. It's the quality of somebody's questions that tells you where they are. If you want help and somebody's asking you questions, or somebody's asking you photography questions, you say, hey, I know this photographer. What have you. So we build on their interests and connections. And don't overload them early on. Don't pile, David York, pile fertilizer on that little tender plant. It's better to do not enough than too much. But it is important that you say a prayer on a regular basis. God, if you know somebody might be ready to know more, tune me in and have that person ask me a question and then help me give the right kind of answer. So I told you, I think 2 weeks ago, about a lady who needed a ride because her car was broken down, and she asked, where do you go to church? I said, 2 churches. If you weren't here, and she says, why 2? And I said, well, there's one right there, as we drove down Main Street. And as we went out past Elko Chapel Eyes, there's another one a mile up the road. And she asked why, and I said, well, I'm a minister. Oh, so why do you preach at 2 churches? Are you the pastor? I said, no. In our church, we have bivocational ministers. We have teams of ministers in each congregation. I'm just one of those teams. Oh, that's very interesting, she said. She stopped asking questions. Now, I wanted to keep talking. But when she stopped asking questions, what did I do? I stopped giving answers. God bless you. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jeff.